Andy, how are you? Kevin, how are you? Brandon,
Good.
I see you. Good morning, sir. Mr. Ramsey, nice to see you.
Morning.
We've got Jason Housley, or as we affectionately call him, Powerhouse, on the call. Zach, thanks for joining us. And Jennifer, I see you guys. Some more coming in. How's everybody doing this morning?
Good.
Yeah. Anybody in Norman? Norman got hit. Carol, this is Tornado Alley down here. And Norman, Oklahoma got hit with some pretty big storms last night. And a lot of my brother-in-law lives down there, and their windows got smashed in with hail. And from what I gather, there was a number of people who will be getting phone calls and knocks on the door from roofing companies starting this afternoon, right?
I hope everybody's okay. That's very scary.
I know. I think we got good morning, Ralph. All right, we've got more people coming in. Got a couple minutes left. Hi, Jennifer. I see you. Good morning.
Hello.
Hi, Kelly. All right, we got just a couple minutes. Anybody having a fun week this week? Andy, what's going on with you?
Well, Kelly's keeping me busy. We got a lot going on, and she's a great teammate, and it's pretty exciting, kind of fun.
Well, that's fantastic. Fantastic. All right, we're going to give it one more minute here. I know we've got a bunch coming in here. All right, I see Mr. Funky's joining us this morning. Good morning, Mark. All right, I tell you what, I've got 9 o'clock. We'll get a few other people coming in here as we get through, but I want to make sure we get the most out of our time today, and our special guest, Carol Roth. Some of you might know her if you're a fan of Fox Business or many of the financial channels that are out there. She's pretty prominent, and I follow her on Twitter. Some great content that she shares, and I was lucky enough last year to have her as a guest on our podcast, The Over 50 Entrepreneur, and had asked her at that point. We were doing the Zoom calls. And asked her if she'd be a guest, and we got her on as quick as we could. She's a pretty busy lady, as you can imagine. And so, I think about like what we do and why, as business owners, we come to work every day. We run these businesses. There's that element of freedom that I think each and every one of us have at least raised our hand and said, well, that's what we're interested in. And I think Carol exemplifies that as an entrepreneur herself, and she fights for small business. And so, as I was thinking about it today, this is a little different conversation. We're gonna go on some topics that have nothing to do with EOS or scaling up or value builder or any of the processes that we talk about as we try to grow our businesses and gain more freedom for ourselves. But it wraps up in the bigger picture of why we need to have this conversation. And so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Without further ado, we've got more people coming on here. I'm going to switch this over, and Carol, I'm going to give you the stage, if you will. And why don't you why don't we start the conversation today by just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about Carol Roth and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I'll do the short version, which is I say that I am an entrepreneur and I play myself on television, small business advocate, and recovering investment banker. It's been sort of a 12-step program. I'm permanently stuck on stage 11, and I've done a ton of things over my career. As I mentioned, investment banking, raising capital, mergers and acquisitions, leverage buyouts, kind of the full gamut there. I've been a reality TV show judge for Mark Burnett. I've been on TV as a panelist and sometimes host for probably 12 years. I invest in companies. I sit on boards of companies. I've been a public company director. I'm currently a private company director. Apologies, let me take my phone out here. And I also run my own small businesses, which include being the outsourced chief customer officer for a company that makes fashion dolls. And I actually have a fashion doll / action figure made in my own likeness. So it's a very wide range of activities, but that's one of the things that I love about being an entrepreneur, and one of the reasons that I ultimately transitioned from a very structured investment banking background to what I do today is I like flexibility and I like freedom. And I think as importantly, I believe in that concept of flexibility, freedom, pursuing your own goals for everyone. I think it's also helpful to know just a little bit about where I came from. You know, neither of my parents went to college. I don't have parents who are college graduates. So I was the first person in my immediate family to get a college degree. I went to Wharton undergrad and then went into the investment banking program. And I've seen the progression from my grandparents and great grandparents who came over and escaped persecution in Eastern Europe, to my father who grew up on the west side of Chicago and was in one of the first Jewish gangs. It's a thing, it was a thing back then, to, you know, being able to kind of buckle down, earn a living and create this better opportunity. And then within a few generations, you know, have kids who have exceeded the level of success by, like, you know, any factor that anybody could potentially dream of. You know, I think that is because of the opportunities that have been historically presented in this country, that have been historically presented by capitalism and entrepreneurship. And I don't believe that I am, you know, any more special than anybody else. I think that anybody can do that depending on whatever their definition of success is. And it's why this, you know, entire conversation, whether it's around small business or entrepreneurship or economic freedom, is so personal to me, because I feel like there are so many people who are now looking down on that level of success or telling people that they can't achieve it. And, you know, I've done it personally. My husband's done it personally. I have people in my family have done it, larger family and friends. And so, you know, that entire discussion becomes very personal for me.
Absolutely. Well, listen, let's go back for a second. You went to Wharton, you did the traditional route, right?
Right.
College, Wharton, and then you went and became an investment banker. So I'm curious, and I'm guessing others might be interested in knowing, was there a point, because there was for me, was there a point in your corporate life that you can remember was kind of that transition point where you said, enough, this isn't the path I'm after?
So the reason I even went into investment banking in the first place is because my family couldn't afford to pay for college. And so I had to pay my own way through college, which I did, you know, working through college, through scholarships, potentially not guaranteeing I might have run a football pool on campus, can't guarantee that, but did come out with about $40,000 in college debt in 1995. And so at that point in time, you know, I said to myself, what's the quickest way that I can pay that down? And the top two options were either investment banking or consulting. And people who like to deep dive into something go into consulting, and people who have ADD and want to work on like a million different things go into investment banking. So I had already started out with, you know, I was going in for a purpose. I actually really loved it and did very, very well. I was a VP and officer of the firm by the time I was 25 years old. But the firm actually got acquired first by, it was like a boutique investment bank, very middle market focused, aggressive growth, meritocracy, and it got acquired first by Nations Bank, and then it merged with Bank of America when those key provisions of Glass-Steagall got repealed, like in the late 90s. So the culture changed. And so that was really the impetus, Rick, that for me was, okay, this is not the sort of the same thing that I've been doing. There's a big shift. Do I want to go and try and recreate this? And when I sat down and thought about that, I felt like I had kind of learned everything that I needed to learn. Like there was a very high learning curve, and certainly every deal is unique, but there's like only so many things. If you're raising capital or if you're selling a business, there are like only so many different variations of that. And so it wasn't as intellectually stimulating, it wasn't as creative for me, but I had created that flexibility, and decided that I was going to try something else. Now, funny enough, the first thing that I ended up doing was starting my own investment bank and my own broker dealer. So I didn't stray that far from it, but that's where I started to add in different services, and some of my clients would ask me to do things that were more creative, which led me to kind of broaden out and do all the other things that I've done.
So everybody on this call is an entrepreneur. They get up every day. They deal with the challenges. We always like to joke that there's glory, right? Like being a business owner, as you said, used to be something that people aspired to, and they still do. It's viewed from different groups a little differently today, but I'm always interested to know, when you made that transition, said, okay, enough of this, I'm going to go do this on my own. What were those early days like? And were there any, did you ever have that moment like, whoa, this isn't exactly what I thought this was going to look like?
Yeah, I always say that there's a rule of 3 in business. Everything takes 3 times as long, is 3 times as expensive, and is 3 times more difficult than you expect it to be, or than it probably should be. And that was certainly my experience with everything that I've pursued as an entrepreneur, from those early days up through even the things that I'm doing today. And so it is this rude awakening. In fact, my first book, The Entrepreneur Equation, is all about that. It's all about, what are the true risks and realities of running your own business, because so many people go in and think it's about doing that one thing that you love to do, or, pursuing something specific. And it's not about running a business. And people who haven't been there don't realize, as I'm sure you all well do, all of the different things that it takes and how much time and attention is taken up by administration and things that really have nothing to do with the core purpose of the business. So it definitely was an awakening for me, and I have beyond so much respect for anybody who chooses this as a path, because I know how difficult it is, and I know that a lot of people from the outside don't appreciate the level of difficulty.
Absolutely. Well, fair enough. Well, listen, I want to go in and talk a little bit about the subject matter of your upcoming book, because I think it's important. But before I do, let's take a quick pause. And I'm just curious from everybody on the call, are there any questions for Carol that anybody would like to ask before we kind of move on to the next segment?
Too early for this?
I was going to say, not enough coffee flowing yet. This is not, I will tell you, Carol, this is not a quiet group. So
Okay.
I have a question, Mark Funke. Tell me, could you just give me a quick sample of the type of investment banking deals that you did? Were they mainly mergers? Were they industry specific? What kind of deals did you do?
Yeah, so I worked on what we consider sort of aggressively growing companies, and I worked across different products. So raising capital, so initial public offerings and follow-on offerings, private placements, both equity and debt, and mergers and acquisitions, as well as kind of hybrids of leverage buyouts and management buyouts. I did a lot in the consumer space, particularly in restaurants. So everything, if you were a restaurant that got financed in the 90s, like I probably touched it, or my group touched it. So the largest franchisee of Papa John's Pizza, P.F. Chang's, Wolfgang Puck, the Cheesecake Factory, Lone Star Steakhouse, Rainforest Cafe, like the list goes goes on and on. I also did some stuff in technology and consumer facing services. So, again, kind of depending on the stage of my career and whether it was at Montgomery Securities or in my own investment banking endeavor, it was a little bit different, but and what kind of took me out of it is I liked anything that really had a story around it, because I felt like, that story is where you get the incremental valuation from. What is it about the Cheesecake Factory or the company that cools down semiconductors, whatever it is, like, how can we not just look at the numbers and the discounted cash flow, but to really look at the story and talk about that growth story. And so that was always particularly interesting to me.
Helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Great question, Mark. Any other questions? Okay, so, Carol and I talked a little bit before we started this morning, and she actually posted a really good piece yesterday that I actually dug into. And, as we look at the last year, we've had a lot of struggles for small business. And I'm just curious, and Carol, I don't mean to take your thunder away here, but anybody in the group want to take a stab at what percentage of small business in Oklahoma closed the doors last year? Yeah. Would you be surprised to know that 32% of small businesses closed last year in Oklahoma? And I think the ironic thing is in my conversation with Carol, she pointed out that the average is actually a little bit higher than that. So Oklahoma has, I guess, by all accounts, done a little better than average. But I think it's an interesting thing, and I want to turn it over to Carol to talk about the book, why you wrote the book, Carol. And as you and I've talked about, it's deeper than just what's happened in 2020. And so why don't you just give us a little bit of your view and tell us a little bit about the book and what you're trying to accomplish with that.
Sure. So the book, which is available for pre-order now, but is coming out on the 29th of June, is called The War on Small Business. And when I wrote my first book, as I mentioned, about 10 years ago, The Entrepreneur Equation, it was really about letting people know about all the risks that there are to running a business and how difficult it was. So when COVID came about, it was very clear to me, like from day one, that small businesses were very potentially vulnerable in this scenario. And I was very early on advocating, okay, this is the state of small business, and this is what people need to do about small business. And so when I was approached by HarperCollins to take sort of an economic look at the pandemic, it was clear that small business was going to be an important part of that story. I just didn't really realize how important a part of the story it was. And to be frank, I wrote 3.5 different books over the last year. And ultimately, this was the one that came out in a number of words that's actually readable and it not sort of double the length that it originally was. But, when people sort of started talking about the pandemic, they said, oh, this is what's called a black swan event. This is something that came out of left field and that nobody could have prepared for and nobody was expecting it. And that's just blatantly untrue. I mean, the reality is that there are plenty of people who were predicting that there was a potential pandemic. The government in 2019 had run with about 14 states actually a practice drill called Crimson Contagion that was for the exact scenario that we went through, that something escaped from a lab in China. I mean, literally the same hypothetical situation that we ended up going through. And what was the response and what was it that needed to happen? So, when I sat down to look at it, I said, that's not a black swan, but there was a black swan. And the black swan was the government's reaction to the pandemic. And that was shutting down large parts of the economy, particularly with the burden borne by 99.9% of all businesses in this country, which are the small businesses. And so I said, that's pretty staggering. And there's so much sort of misinformation that has happened around, what happened with the lockdowns. The reality is, for places that did lock down, there were plenty of large businesses that were deemed essential by mandates that never ever locked down. So you could have somebody who was doing people nails or people hair being mandated as closed, and next door you could have PetSmart that was grooming dog nails and dog hair, and they like never shut down, or in some cases decided they were to shut down on their own for a couple weeks and then came back. And so there was a lot of picking winners and losers, and doing so without proper compensation for small businesses' property rights. And so, that was kind of the framework of what I wanted to talk about is, why did we have, whether it was the government mandates, from governors or mayors or local officials, or the Federal Reserve supporting the markets, but not necessarily giving the same level of support to small businesses. How did small businesses get the small end of the stick? And then as I kind of look back on it, and this may be very obvious to many of you, but it's always that way, right? Whether it's, in tax policy, whether it's in permitting, whether it's in, special deals, the small businesses, which were supposed to be the backbone of the country, always get the small end of the stick. So I wanted to explore everything from our relationship with China to the Fed to all the things that sort of influence why small businesses are quote unquote too small to matter, when we were told during the last crisis that a bunch of banks that did things on their own volition were too big to fail.
Sorry, Carol, I had myself on mute. It's absolutely the case. And, I've thought a lot about the business owners, the entrepreneurs that I get to talk to on a regular basis. And what's fascinating to me is we know that small business, the entrepreneur is the innovator, right? Like there's a young lady here in Oklahoma that is finding a way to take agriculture and develop alternatives to plastics, putting farmers to work, doing things like that grow. And story after story, we hear of things like that. And then on the flip side, what I think about is I had Representative Kevin Hern actually on our podcast. And, he made the comment, something that stuck with me. He made the comment that the people in DC making policy for small business, most of them have never held a job outside of the government, let alone ever owned a small business.
Right.
And he's tried to do something as a business owner, which he is. He's tried to do something on that. But you made a comment about compensation for property rights. And I'm curious, that's an interesting view versus PPP program or some of the other programs that have been put out there. Do you mind kind of drilling down on that a little bit more?
Not at all. And so I will say everything that I'm talking about here is the culmination of my own personal experience, but also a ton of research. I have about 500 cited sources in the book and hundreds more that didn't make it into the book. So the eminent domain concept came from a number of different people, Scott Lincecum at Cato and Stefan Bagny at Clark Hill. So I'm going to do my best to give credit where credit is due, but if I forget somebody who this has all been informed by the research. So basically, if you think about what rights we have in America, which is sort of the unique example in the world of having rights that we were granted and the government was set up to protect. And why, by the way, America for so long had been so successful and why so many people came here to pursue the American dream. One of the things that is part of our individual rights is our property rights, which means that anything that you own, whether it's your intellectual property and your ideas to your iPhone or whatnot, cannot be taken away by the government for their own use or for social good, right? It's the individual versus the group, and they're supposed to be protecting your individual rights. So sometimes the government says, oh, well, there's a piece of land we need to, run a pipeline through, whatever it is. And there's a concept that's protected in the Constitution called eminent domain, that if your property is taken for public good, that you must receive just compensation for it. Because if we don't protect our property, then people aren't willing to take the same level of risks. And we can later go into China and how they differ in that, and sort of their version of, communist capitalism that they have. So the idea was, kind of going back to the 2008 crisis, when you have these banks that were too big to fail and there was this bailout. The argument that I made and other people were making, put together around eminent domain, is that this isn't a bailout. This is saying if you want certain businesses to close, particularly for extended periods of time, then that's saying that you have to give up your property for the public good, for the social good, which is fine if you're going to provide the just compensation for that. But that's not what happened. There was no compensation up front for that. When we got to the CARES package, a very small percentage of that went to small business. And then the initial structure of that wasn't giving it to those businesses necessarily whose rights had been violated. So the whole constitutional protection of small business and the structure that allows people in this country to take risks and make those investments was completely cast aside, which is very scary in terms of thinking about wanting to take the risks that you do and investing your capital and your time and your money. And I think that unfortunately the discussion around that has gotten twisted. Oh, well, small businesses got PPP. Well, again, it was a fraction of what everybody else got. It wasn't, in the frame of eminent domain. And, also, if you think about it, the small business owners, you had to apply and go through a loan process. If you're the Kennedy Center, which by the way had, about a $500 million in assets, they got $25 million, I think it was, for deep cleaning of, the facilities, because they were well connected. And it wasn't a loan. It was just a straight out, here you go, listed out. And the backbone of the economy was made to jump through the hoops, even though the rights were violated. So it's this whole discussion about government picking winners and losers, and who is well connected and who isn't well connected, and who loses out in the process. And is there something more going on there? And I would argue that there is, because small business is that decentralization that stands against centralized power. I mean, small businesses are independent. That's the whole point, right? People don't get together and form coalitions and you put lobbying dollars down and support these politicians. You're out running your business. You want to be left alone and to do your thing. And unfortunately, that has become something that has been exploited. And we saw the outcome of that. And the reality is, as you were pointing out, Rick, by some of the statistics, small businesses got murdered because it wasn't their fault. It wasn't something they did. It was the fact that their rights were subjugated and they weren't given the proper compensation that they were due via the Constitution.
Wow. Go ahead, Mark. You got a question.
Yeah, I just, can you just talk about, I mean, aside from the pandemic issues,
Yes.
what would be your thought on the primary reasons small business fail? I mean, we talked about all these businesses that failed at 32% in Oklahoma. I'm assuming many of those failed just strictly because of the pandemic and lack of demand, and people weren't coming into their stores or the business, that sort of thing. But do small businesses fail because of lack of plan, no experience? They don't have the right product. They don't have the right delivery mechanism. What would you say would be the top reasons that small business entrepreneurs ought to step back and say, I need to make sure I'm doing this right?
Sure. So kind of aside from these structural issues that we've been talking about in terms of just the things that you have a little bit more control of, I think that kind of going back to my rule of 3, that a lot of small businesses out of the gate don't give themselves enough runway. So it's been my experience that businesses take about 3 years to create a foundation. That is not usually in the plan in terms of how much capital that you need or how much support you need. And my favorite example of this is Oprah. I call it TGFO, thank goodness for Oprah. When Oprah changed her business model from her show to the OWN network, within a very short period of time, everyone was saying, this isn't going to make it. The OWN network's not going to make it. And if you think about Oprah Winfrey, who has more money than probably all of us combined, who has the best network, knows everybody that she needs to potentially know to make something too successful, to promote. It took her about 3 years until OWN finally could stand on its own, no pun intended. And so, if Oprah Winfrey is going to take 3 years to transition her already existing business to something else, that's a reasonable expectation for anyone else. So I think that not giving yourself enough runway is a huge issue. I think on the capital side, everybody thinks that they need more and more money, but don't always have a really good plan to deploy that money, and don't have a good sense of what return that they're looking for from the deployment of that capital. So there are so many times, particularly the early stages of business, when you say, okay, well, if I had this money, I would be fine. But when you really press the entrepreneur, it's like, well, where are you deploying it? How are you deploying it? If it's marketing, what's your customer acquisition cost? Kind of those key metrics and what you're expecting to get back. A lot of people don't have that nailed down well enough. So when they take the capital, they end up burning through it and then put themselves in a position where they need to raise more capital without having the results from what they did with the first capital raise. And I think that creates a huge issue for businesses. And then in my own, I have a community of about 10,000 entrepreneurs that participates in PR and various things with me. And I can tell you, and this has been sort of checked out in a number of different things that we've done with big brands as well, the number one issue that we hear outside of administration for small businesses is, how do I get customers? Over and over again, some version of marketing, PR, but it always boils down to, I need more customers. And I think that those are the biggest reasons. Certainly as businesses move along, there are other process reasons, things that people are trying to do too much themselves and not delegating out and creating those processes and those systems. But at the kind of the early stages, I would say that. If you're looking at the later stages, I would recommend a different book by Les McCune called Predictable Success. I don't know if any of you have read that, but that's a great one regarding the stages of different businesses and how so many businesses kind of get to this peak and then end up falling off. And it's about business life cycle. And so for those who are kind of a little bit further on in the journey and want to focus more on the operational processes side of failure and what happens in a more mature business, that's a really great book.
Great stuff. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
What parameters do you use, to either one of you, Rick or Carol, to define a small business?
So that's a really good question. I tend to believe that if a business gets to about 10 or $15 million in sales, that they move into the mid-market. Also, kind of depending on the business, because obviously it's different for a restaurant than it is for a software company versus a nail salon. But if you're at sort of that like 100 employee level, I also kind of feel like that pushes you over. But so that's kind of like a personal definition, but I also fall back on the SBA's definition, which is so messed up that it's completely varied by industry. So like if you're in a fishery, it might be this, but if you're in something else, it might be that. And pre-pandemic, they counted about 30.2 million small businesses, of which 6 million of those had employees, and the rest of those were solo businesses. And Kelly, does that sort of jive with how you define small business?
Well, I was just wondering, for the statistic of 32% of small businesses in Oklahoma failed last year, I was just wondering what.
So let me address that, and then Rick, I'll let you answer that. But so what I have found is that most entities that cover small business don't understand a lick about small business, again, because it is so varied. So even when Treasury Secretary Mnuchin under the last administration was talking about how many of the small businesses in America were reached with PPP, he only counted the those that had employees. He didn't consider any of the solopreneurs, which make up the bulk of it. So, and obviously make extensive use of contractors. So most of the time when you hear these statistics, it's usually surveyed. So like if you go to Yelp and Yelp has this many people on their platform and now they have this many, that's kind of, their look at it. Or they go out to Goldman Sachs small business program, or they go to some sample size, but they're not looking necessarily at the broader landscape. So I would say that, that's kind of based on survey, and it's probably in the cases of the numbers that we're seeing, the 35 and 32%, those kind of consumer facing businesses that have actual locations would be my guess, just being in and around the data. But we don't have a good answer yet, and probably won't for, I'm guessing, another 6 months to a year of how many actual small businesses closed and whether or not that will take into account solopreneurs as well.
So, and it's a great question, Kelly. And, the thing for me that's interesting is, let's say in a normal economy, right? Most businesses that get themselves to a position to sell, less than 21% of those actually ever make it to the end of the line, right? So statistically, you never know, was this retirement? It's not to be controversial, but the reality is data always skews different things, and you got to look at it, like as serious as COVID has been, and I hate to bring it up, but it was amazing to me that different types of causes of death declined, right? So we never know in the middle, and I think to that point, that's how I read this piece. But what I'll do is it tells you the source of the data is Opportunity Insights Online Data Tracker. And if you want the link to the article, email me. I'd be happy to send it to you. Just email me and tell me that you'd like to have that article, and I'll send it so you guys can kind of look at it yourself. Carol,
and I would say another source too, that I had used last year that I'm waiting to update is the Hamilton Project, which is in conjunction with Harvard and the Gates Foundation. And they were the ones that came out last June and said 400,000 permanent closures by last June. And so they have, they're tracking various different data types, and I'm waiting for them to kind of get a full fallout number, but that's another one that they go deep into a lot of data as well, and is I think a pretty neutral source.
Great. So Carol, okay, so we know last year was tough. We know we're talking about the number of businesses that closed the door, what that really means. We talked about, like, your focus is really trying to bring out the point that centralized government is doing these things for certain power. We've talked about China, the different influences of the way things have been going for 30, 40 years. Here's my question, because unfortunately we don't have all day, we don't have 3 hours to talk about this, and I think we could really dig in, and that's why I think the book is interesting as you delve into some of these. Here's my question. We're all sitting here as business owners, entrepreneurs, Americans. what is it that we can do, right? Or what should we be thinking about? How do we navigate forward so we can make sure we're not a statistic, that falls by the wayside?
Yeah, and it's one of those things, and this is not meant to be political, it's just meant to be advocacy, because this is something that's nonpartisan and affects everyone. I keep calling it the Green Party, right? It's the financial implications for everyone. It's not red, white, blue, otherwise, it's just green. I think that because we are so focused on running our businesses and running our lives, that we don't spend enough time lobbying at the local level, local and states. And I think people don't appreciate that having 10 or 20 people calling an office about an issue that affects small business actually makes those representatives very nervous, because they don't get a lot of phone calls. They don't get a lot of people shaking the trees. And there's a whole slew of proposals that are out now, from raising a national minimum wage to the PRO Act, which would threaten the ability to use independent contractors or gig workers, which is obviously a big issue for small business. Raising the capital gains rate. I know that everyone says, oh, how does that affect small business? But the implications of somebody trying to control risk and capital means that small businesses are going to end up with less capital. One of the things I actually talk about in the book is the Dodd-Frank legislation from the last crisis that was meant to rein in the big banks, and it gave them more free rein. It ended up putting small community banks out of business and making it harder for smaller entrants to come in, which obviously impacts small business owners' ability to get capital. So, whether or not you think that this is intentional or just, a byproduct of, too small to matter, it doesn't make a difference. We need more people who are small business owners to stand up and to say, hey, this is how this affects me, and this is how this affects the backbone of the economy, and you can't do this to us. You guys aren't thinking through the range of solutions. It sounds helpful or sounds good from a top line standpoint, but when we peel back, I think that's important. And I also think just sharing stories about capitalism and your personal experience, and why you're a small business owner, and how much of our economy is the backbone of the economy, because you get to hear about Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and these couple of guys over and over again who are these exceptions to the rule, and they've become sort of the poster child for we don't like capitalism. And now you've got an entire younger generation that is more open to things like communism. I mean, it's really scary. And I think that more people who are your neighbor educating you and sharing, why you're a small business owner, why economic freedom is important, the work that you put into it, what that outcome is, helps just to put that information into the dialogue that right now is lacks any nuance. It's all just very, I'm on one side or the other side, and the whole nuanced sort of middle of the discussion, which tends to be where most people are at, is getting lost. So I think that just you could continue to tell your story. There was one last February that we did on Twitter. There was a hashtag called iBootstrapped, where people were telling stories about where they came from and what they built based on whatever level of success was important to them in their business. And it was like the most positive, uplifting thing that you've ever seen on social media. I think we need to have more of those reflections of discussion in the discourse. Rick, did you have other thoughts of things that people should be doing?
I was just going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head. What I love about working with business owners, being a business owner, entrepreneurs, we all have our own views, right? We have our own, and the word agenda is not right, but we have things that we believe, our own belief systems. But at the end of the day, it truly is about being able to give value and be productive and innovate. And I think regardless of where we stand ideology-wise, we can agree on that. And I hope that a conversation like this, right, gives us an opportunity to have a little bit of discord in a nice way, all wanting to do the same thing, which is succeed, have our freedom, as entrepreneurs and business owners, and help other people. And so I think that's wonderful that you bring up that point. Open it up.
If I could just add one thing to that, anything that a government entity is going to do to create a barrier is going to take away from an economic freedom opportunity for you or for somebody else. And what's been so great about the country is that people come here from all over the world. You can be in the most vulnerable community, and if you have something that you're passionate about, particularly now that 70% of our businesses are services based, and so a lot of those don't need as much capital to get going than maybe a product based company, that anybody can chart that path for themselves. And so we don't want to have people who've benefited from that pull up the ladder behind them, right? You want to provide that opportunity to as many people as possible. And so I think just keeping those barriers down so that people do have the opportunities and can make their own decisions on what's right for them will continue to create that level of prosperity for future generations. And unfortunately, that messaging is getting lost.
Absolutely. Well, let's open it up. Anybody additional questions for Carol while we have her?
Hey, Rick, I've just been sitting here thinking about reflecting on advocacy just in general. One of the things that I don't know, I probably learned like 10 years ago is, you kind of keep your thoughts to yourself, because you lose business if you're out there, on social media talking about, whatever your thoughts are. So my policy is always, for the last 10 years, has been, social media and advocacy on social media, advocacy period is a double-edged sword. That yes, you can affect change if you can organize folks into a group that was, willing to go out and make the phone calls to our local representatives. But it's in that organizing itself that you open yourself up to, you open yourself up to the liability of, other folks that are out in the community that may be your customers, maybe your family, friends, seeing this advocacy in a different light. So I'm hesitant. Any thoughts on that?
Jeff, so what you're saying, it's an additional business risk, right?
Yeah, and I was thinking about that too. Like so here's the risk, right? You don't advocate and you continue to see rights erode.
Yeah.
Or you do advocate and you lose, friends, family, contacts that you have worked hard to establish in the community, potentially. Those are the things that are the conflicting thoughts in my head.
Yeah, well, I think that, obviously every situation is different. The good news is that most people support small business, even if they say that, oh, I hate capitalism. Like, most people are rooting for the small guy. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the framing, but your advocacy can be personal. And you also know, who you can have the discussion with and who you can't. So you picking up the phone to call your representative privately is not something that necessarily threatens to you. And you talking about yourself as a business owner, hopefully, again, that putting it in that veil and not making it a political statement, but just say, hey, I'm sharing my experience, and I think this, people want to hear about small business and why this is important to small business. You have to decide where that line is for your customer base, and it is a real risk. And that's the scary part about it, is that the people who feel like, I don't want to get in the middle of this, like you said, we've seen the rights eroding because the people who have nothing to lose are willing to kind of go out there and set the agenda. So yes, it's an area that you should tread carefully, but I think especially on the advocacy with your representatives, there's a way to do that more privately, and I'm not necessarily saying like to put a big banner about that on social media, but share your experiences as a small business owner on social media, and share that positivity, and then do your advocacy more privately, unless again you feel like you're in a position or there's something that's really important that you feel like more people should be involved with and know about.
Hey,
But
Rick.
very good point.
Yes,
Let
Mark.
me throw something in there on the advocacy side, and I agree with what our speaker said about calling your representative directly, and I would certainly encourage all of our business owners to do that. But I would also put a plug in for our state chamber. The Oklahoma State Chamber has one objective, and that is the focus on advocacy for business positive legislation. So if your advocacy requires legislation, then I would talk to someone at the state chamber and go through their litany of issues that they're working on. And they may not know about your issue specifically, but if you bring it to their attention, it may become part of their advocacy list, and they will advocate for you without you being the front and center person. So the state chamber does a really good job of that. That's the only thing they do. And if you've got some issues legislatively that you think need to help your business or work for your business, or stuff going against your business, I'd call the state chamber, talk to one of the reps over there, and figure out whether that's on their list, and get it on their list if it's not.
It's a great
Hey, Mark, do you think that the state chamber is also open to the same kind of advocacy like that she's speaking about, where folks in the community could essentially lobby the state chamber and in that way determine the direction of the state chamber, and then that way use the state chamber to determine the direction of advocacy? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is this: the state chamber each year has a group of business owners across the entire state, several hundred, that get together and put together the list, so to speak, of what the state chamber should be working on. So they gather information from business owners all across the state from a legislative standpoint.
Okay.
And this is the business line that they're going to be working on with legislators. If you go to them and say, wait a second, for my business, this is what I need, and it's not on your list, so let me tell you why it should be. And then if you can convince them that it should be part of it has to be business only. There's no social agenda here. It's just business. And if you can convince them that something that they don't have on their list is something you need, I think you can probably get it on their list, and they'll put that as part of their lobbying effort when they put that together. And you can also go to the state chamber website and see a total listing of all the things that they're advocating for.
I think I was confusing the state chamber with other local chambers, because I do see advocacy on the local level at some of the local chambers that I don't agree with.
Absolutely. The local chambers do things very differently. They work on economic development. They work on all kinds of other issues, but the state chamber is singularly focused on business favorable legislation. That's all they do.
Thank you.
So, Carol, I have a question concerning the government response to this, that was the black swan. Do you think it was intentional, or did they just fumble the football?
So I think, so first of all, I would say part of the mystery that unfolds in the book is that it kind of doesn't matter from a small business standpoint, whether you think it was intentional. I don't need to convince you of that. I just need to convince you that the small business owner is not of the interest of the central planning politicians. Everything that I have seen leads me to believe that there is some level of intentionality. And again, this is just my opinion, and I totally respect the other opinion, but there has been this incredible move. If you can think of a spectrum where you have complete free market capitalism on one side, which we've never had, but maybe aspects of it, and complete central planning on the other side. The US has exported capitalism to places like China, and it has imported central planning, and it has moved closer to central planning, regardless of how you define it, whether you define it on how much money they're spending before COVID at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. It's about $8.1 trillion, which is about the equivalent to the median family income per households, so like 60 some odd $1,000 per household. Whether it's the number of laws, there have been, and it was like a 40-year period at the state levels, over 1 million laws passed, and at the federal level, over 20,000 laws passed, and like another 15,000 regulations passed. The level of control into people's lives, those kinds of things. Like, we're moving more towards central planning every single day. And when you think about small business is decentralization. And we have all of this movement towards decentralization. You have people who are interested in cryptocurrencies and DeFi because they don't trust the Fed and Wall Street and the government, and they want to decentralize finance. You have the gig economy and gig workers who are decentralizing the corporate job. Small businesses decentralize the economy and the corporate structure. But decentralization is the biggest threat to central power. And if you saw what happened last year, there were 7 companies that gained $3.4 trillion in value during the worst pandemic of all time, a record number of IPOs, a record number of SPACs and access to capital at the same time that more than 40 million people had filed for unemployment at one point in time, and the GDP was at record low and small businesses were failing. And so just looking at that, you can see the centralization versus the decentralization battle, and that has accelerated. And I think that is intentional, because if you just look at all the policies, and again, this is not about one party or the other, there's just more control at the central level, and the politicians want to keep that level of control, and small businesses, again, either too hard to control or too small to matter, don't fit in that. So I feel like there's some level, but again, it doesn't matter even if you think it's just that it's too big to succeed, it's incompetent. That's not okay either. That's why, that's like the fun thing about the conversation is I actually don't even need to convince you on the lockdowns. I don't need to convince you if you believe in liberty or lockdowns. They didn't do either of them. So that's the interesting part of this discussion. In an era where everyone's so divided, it's like you can still have your opinion and still understand the big issues for this war against small business.
Well said. Well said. Well, unfortunately, we're coming to the last few minutes of our time today. And before I kind of wrap up, Carol, here we've got some wonderful people on this call today. They're hardworking entrepreneurs. They're taking care of employees. They're taking care of their families, the community. So what parting thoughts, what would you want them, let me put it another way. People leaving here today, they're going to think about a lot of things.
Yeah.
What would be the 2 or 3 things that you'd want them to take away from our time today with you?
So I'm just going to add a few things that maybe we haven't already discussed. First of all, I respect and admire every single one of you and appreciate your perseverance. Individually, you help make up the backbone of the economy. You're serving your family, you're serving the broader economy, and the concept of economic freedom. So I think that's just fantastic and inspiring, and encourage you. If anything I can do to be helpful on that journey, please feel free to reach out. What I would say is I have found in my own journeys that the places that I have been most successful is where I've had intentional, very concrete goals along the way. So very specific, whether it's in customer counts, revenue, margins, whatever it is, but like very specific things that I'm working on. And then, sort of a milestone map, working backwards from that milestone map to get there. And obviously those can change as you go, but I think working towards something really specific is very important for small business owners, because you can get very caught up in the day-to-day processes of just doing stuff, but not really think about like why you're doing it or what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I would encourage you to continually, maybe once or twice a year, sit down and evaluate that, and periodically evaluate your milestones to that. Something else that I also spend a lot of time focusing on with my team is I sit down twice a year and I say, is there anything that you are doing that you feel like is a waste of your time or could be better done by someone else or technology? Because I feel like sometimes people aren't being used to their best purpose, and that is a drag on your business. And so just realigning is, are there every year, especially in my one business where we do customer loyalty, there are so many things that we've continued to automate processes for, even just on a small level over time, that have freed up time for people to be doing higher value add activities. Technology continues to evolve, continues to be more accessible to small business owners. So I would certainly have that kind of strategic level. And it goes back to, if you know Michael E. Gerber, the E-Myth Revisited, like the Bible for small businesses and automation, it's that working on your business versus in your business and making sure that you're carving out the time to do that. So I think that's critically important as well.
Good. Well, thank you, Carol. And guys, I highly recommend, if you're a Twitter person, follow Carol. Business, some great business stuff, but also some fun. I love the Friday stuff. I love the pets. It gives me a smile on social media, which isn't always what you get from that. Tell us again the name of the book.
Yes.
It's on Amazon. We can pre-order.
So no, don't go. Well, you can. It's
Okay.
capitalism, so you can do whatever you want. But it's called The War on Small Business. And if you are so inclined, a suggestion I would have for this book and all books is that there is a site called bookshop.org. And bookshop.org allows you to fulfill your book purchases through local independent small businesses. Because part of capitalism is voting with our wallets and making sure that we're supporting small businesses and not just giving everything to Amazon and going, why are all these small businesses going away? So if you're so inclined to support the book, which hopefully you'll enjoy, and I think between the Fed and trying to learn a lot, consider bookshop.org. But I am a proponent of free market capitalism. And in fairness to Amazon, they do support 1.9 million small to medium sized businesses as well, although there's some scariness in that as well. But I will leave it up to you all. Fantastic point. And we appreciate you. Also, guys, check out the podcast if you haven't, with Carol and I go into some other issues. It's interesting because I think those of you that have been in the community, been part of what we do over the years, understand that we've always been around. At the end of the day, it's a business owner community. We're not doing this on our own. We can get a lot farther by learning together, connecting, helping each other, helping other entrepreneurs, which leads me to 2 upcoming events where we're going to spend the day working on your business, connecting with other business owners, going through different exercises designed around creating more freedom for the entrepreneur. We did this last in October of 2019, and it received a lot of great feedback. As I've been thinking about how we come out of 2020, I've decided to put my toe in the water. We're going to do a live event in Oklahoma City on June 17th. That's an all-day event with, again, networking and looking at your business, going through some principles. We're going to do the same thing in Tulsa on July 14th. If you're interested in learning more, email me. We'll have a special discounted pricing for our immediate group. We'll get that out to you. But it's all about doing what Carol's advocating today, and which is the other thing, is make sure that we're out there advocating in a way that's productive and thought-provoking, where we can deliver and continue to do what I think. I look back, and Carol, you hit on this, what my parents, my grandparents came over to this country long time ago as immigrants. My parents never went to college either, and we still had the greatest opportunity. I want to make sure that opportunity is here for the next generation and generations to come. And so thank you for your time. We really appreciate you. Let me know if you need anything, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for including me. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.